There is a thing you have earned with your own hands, a name no one else can take from you. Now, imagine a voice telling you to lay it down, not for a failure, just to lay it down. What would you actually say? A man once stood at the edge of a war camp and answered that question with silence. 7th century Levant, the sun going low over tents that smelled of leather and horses. He was a commander, and until that evening, every order in that camp had been his. Someone had ridden in with a letter. The letter said the command was no longer his. He handed it over. He did not argue. He did not ask why. The chroniclers who counted his campaigns record the same thing. Not once did he leave a field as the loser. But the trial that would define him had nothing to do with a battlefield. It waited for the day the fighting stopped. His name was Khalid ibn al-Walid, the one they called the Sword of Allah. And this evening was the first order he never gave. Long before any of that, there was only a young rider on the training fields of Mecca at the dawn of the 7th century. He belonged to the Banu Makhzum, one of the proud houses of Quraysh, and horses had been in his hands since boyhood. He learned the lance at full gallop, the weight of tribal honor, whose name earned respect, whose earned a blade. His people trusted him with their cavalry. Few men his age could hold a line the way he could. He was barely into his 20s, a proud officer of a settled world, certain its order was how things were meant to be. The old gods still stood in their sanctuary, unchallenged. The seasons of trade and raid turned as they always had. Khalid ibn al-Walid rode at the front of them. But that world had begun, very quietly, to tremble. A man in the city was preaching against the old gods, calling the whole order into question. To the young houses of Quraysh, this was no debate. A threat Khalid was trained to answer with steel. So the young houses of Quraysh reached for their swords. Khalid reached first. Picture the slopes of Uhud near Medina in the year 625. A young cavalry commander waits at the fight's edge, watching a battle he's already lost. The Muslim line has broken the Meccan advance, and archers set to guard the high ground behind them leave their post to gather the spoils. The rider sees the gap open. He says nothing, and he moves. His name is Khalid ibn al-Walid. He gathers his horsemen, sweeps around the undefended hill, and strikes the Muslim army from behind. A victory becomes a rout in the space of minutes. It is a maneuver so clean that witnesses will describe it again and again to their grandchildren. The rider had turned the day, and something in him would never sit easy with how he had done it. His finest tactical gift serves a world he will later abandon. Khalid would later call Uhud his most painful victory, and not yet say why. In the year 629, the finest cavalry mind Mecca had ever trained turned his horse toward Medina. The men he had scattered on that slope were now the brothers he came to join. That was why he called Uhud his most painful victory. He asked for nothing. He carried only the weight of everything he had done before. The test came almost at once. At Mu'tah, a small Muslim force met an army many times its size. One by one, the 3 appointed commanders fell. Then the men looked to Khalid. His old world would have demanded a glorious death, a last charge remembered for generations. But he had a different habit, older than his faith and sharper than his sword. Before every decision, he counted his living men. Some 3,000 men stood before him, against odds no one records with hope. So he did the hardest thing a warrior can do. He withdrew them, whole and disciplined, saving nearly every remaining life. In the market, an old man with prayer beads turned his back and said one ugly word aloud. Coward. The men who had run away, they whispered. And as the accusations spread through the streets, word arrived that the prophet himself had something to say about what Khalid did at Mu'tah. The prophet gave him the title for the retreat, not for the blood. Saif Allah, the sword of Allah. He earned it at Mu'tah, you remember, for the retreat that brought the men home, not for a kill. The next year, he carried that name into Mecca. this time at the head of a peaceful column. The city had once cast him out as an enemy. Now he came back without drawing a sword. Then the prophet was gone, and Arabia began to come apart. Tribe after tribe turned away. Could Khalid hold the young community together? At Yamama, he met the false prophet's army in the fiercest fight of those wars, a field the survivors called the Garden of Death. He turned toward Iraq. City after city along the Euphrates opened to him, faster than word of it could travel. Then he did the thing no one expected. He crossed a waterless desert into Syria, wide as a small country, and lived. At the Yarmouk River, he broke a far larger Byzantine army. The young community he had feared for held after all. The record the chroniclers gave him, never once broken, still stood. And then, at the very peak, Caliph Umar took his command away. Not for any defeat, but so the people would remember that victory belonged to Allah and to no single man. Khalid said nothing. He took an ordinary soldier's place and marched on beside the men he had led. And so the sword of Allah marched on foot, an ordinary soldier in the dust, his command laid down without a word. In the year 642, in the Syrian city of Homs, an old man lay dying in his bed. No trumpet sounded, no enemy waited beyond the wall. Only the ache of a body that 100 battles had somehow never claimed. Now he spent his final hours in prayer, far from any field he had ever won. He looked over a body scarred by more than 100 battles, and grieved that not one of them had killed him. He had always expected to fall as a warrior falls. Instead, this: soft ground, a quiet man. But that grief was the last thing he ever surrendered. The general who never lost a battle had, at the end, lost the death he wanted, and accepted even that from a hand greater than his own. His greatest victory was never a city or a crossing. It was this. We began with a man handing over his command and saying nothing at all. Here, at last, you feel why. When the sword you spent your whole life earning is asked for, could you set it down without a word? The story ends. The wisdom does not.